don't need it out now.
There are more seats at the front if anyone would like to come further forward. Also a few seats in the middle of your right-hand side, coming from the back. Yeah. Tēnā koutou, tēnā katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, ki te pūkenga here tikanga mahi, the PSA. So welcome here today. We are very pleased to have you all here today. And I think we're all here because we're all interested in a better working life for ourselves, for others as well, and we're all interested in better public services. So bullying is something that's not part of either of those things, is it? It's not part of a better working life. It's not part of what should be working in public services. So that's the reason why we've collaborated with the Centre for Labour, Employment and Work at Victoria University on some research around workplace behaviours and other matters as well, and that's why we are running the seminar here today. So my name is Kirsten Winderlove. I'm from the PSA's policy team. You'll have met some of my other colleagues outside when you came in. So welcome to you, and we're really glad to have you here. As I said earlier, we will run to time. So we'll have two presentations today. We have Andrea From, who, do you want to stand up so people know who you are? Great. So Andrea is a colleague of mine in the policy team here at the PSA, but she's lately returned from Europe, where she worked for Eurofound, which I don't know if many of you know is the European Union's research institute around living and working conditions. So it's a tripartite European Union agency. Andrea was involved with a report that she's going to talk about today, which is the 2015 report on violence and harassment in European workplaces. So she'll talk to you about that. So very much the focus today is on what happens in workplaces, what do employers do, what works and what doesn't. So that's very much our focus here. And the second presentation will be from Jeff Blinner and Hamish Crimp. So, and here they are. So Jeff is a senior lecturer at the School of Management. I'll read his bio so I don't get it wrong, with interest in workplace bullying, leadership, wellbeing and performance. And he's led the work on the research work on workplace dynamics in the New Zealand Public Service, which was a collaboration with the PSA, and which gathered data on bullying and harassment in the public service. Some of you may have completed the surveys for that, the questionnaires for that survey over time. There have been 3 in total. It's longitudinal. So Hamish has recently completed his master's thesis on public sector responses to bullying at the School of Management as well. They ran this presentation on Monday over at Victoria, and it was extremely well received. So I wasn't able to get there, so I'm very excited to hear it, and I'm sure you'll all have questions. So the questions, we will take all questions at the end of both presentations. So we'll wait till both presentations are finished, and then we'll take questions there, and we'll make sure that we've got plenty of time for questions as well. The thing I haven't told you about is housekeeping, which is always the funnest bit. So if there's a fire or if there's an earthquake, there will be, we do have trained emergency response people here in the building. If there's a fire, there will be an alarm. It's the usual procedure of filing out down the stairwells and then cross the road, cross Aurora Terrace, and you line up on the other side of Aurora Terrace, so just on this side of the Aurora Centre over there. If there's an earthquake, please drop cover and hold. This building has got a good earthquake rating and performance in the previous ones we had, and that reassures me, although I don't, maybe it shouldn't. I'm not sure. Anyway, if you need to use the bathrooms, they're either side of the lifts there. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to to talk to a PSA staff member. We're all wearing these things, either a red or an orange, one of these dangly lanyards outside. Okay, so I'll hand over now to Andrea.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Thank you all for coming. I mean, this is an amazing crowd. I'm really pleased to have you all here, to welcome you to the PSA. I just wanted to add to Kirsten's introduction that I actually worked in the public sector here in New Zealand as well. I worked for Statistics New Zealand, and some of my colleagues are here, so wonderful to see you in particular. Most of the presentation today will be based on the report that I wrote with a few colleagues back in Europe in 2015. And I will just give you a little bit of an overview of what's happening in Europe, how violence and harassment is measured over there, but also I will talk a little bit about what is done in terms of preventing it or tackling the problem. And then I will be followed by Hamish and Jeff, who talk more about the New Zealand context. So, and one thing maybe before I start, I will use the term social partners quite a bit. With social partners, I'm referring to employers, organizations on the one hand side, and the trade unions on the other side. As you might be aware, they play an important role in the European context, on the EU context, the European Union context, but also in the national countries, because a lot of activities are done in a tripartite fashion together with governments or in a bipartite way between the social partners. So I thought I'll start with my key messages just to guide you through the presentation as well. The first one is that measurement of violence and harassment is still very difficult in Europe, and that the definitions are not at all aligned in the different countries. The second important point is that we didn't find a major increase or decrease of violence and harassment in Europe. It is fairly steady. There are some countries where it's increasing and in other countries slightly decreasing, but over time it's very steady, and that's why I will just focus on some results from our, I think it was 2010 survey, which is comparable across countries. I will talk about that a bit later. And in terms of policy, we found that it is crucial to still continue awareness-raising campaigns and to, especially for governments, to consider coherent policies, not just a focus on violence, but to look at working conditions, for instance, as well. And you will see later why. So let's talk about measuring violence and harassment to start with. What our report used as a definition, as a basis, was a definition taken from something that is called an autonomous framework agreement. This is a legal tool given to the EU social partners to come up with an agreement on a definition and some associated activities. It's not a legal tool, but the social partners commit by agreeing to this agreement, by signing it, they agree to or own the implementation process. So this agreement on violence and harassment was signed by the social partners in 2007, and the implementation had to be done by 2010, which meant that the social partners from each country, from all 28 countries, had to file a report on how they implemented violence and harassment prevention policies or other measures. So this is the definition they agreed on, and the way they described it was that it can be either physical, psychological, or sexual, and it can take all those different components down there. It can come out as a criminal offense, it can be an abuse, it can be threatening, it can be humiliation, it can be mobbing, bullying, or disrespect. And importantly, it can be a one-off incidence, or it can be a systematic pattern of incidences. The next slide highlights what is also part of the agreement, the different levels of of violence and harassment. So you can see here it can happen on a horizontal level, so between colleagues, on a vertical level, between a manager and a subordinate, into both directions, very important. And they are also mentioning third-party violence, which is particularly important when you're dealing with clients or patients, customers, and that is acknowledged as an important form of violence and harassment as well. This slide, I would like you to keep in mind throughout the whole presentation, my presentation and also the follow-up presentation, because it is quite significant when looking at results, for instance. We found that the socioeconomic, political, cultural, but also work context are very important when talking about or assessing awareness levels of people. And you can imagine that if you are more aware about an incident, for example, being called a violent incident or a harassing incident, then you're able to identify it as such, and therefore you can report it as well when you're surveyed, when you ask for it. And that means that more information and knowledge is available to the policymakers, who can then design and develop policies which are actually tackling the problems as they stand at the moment, and hopefully instigate change with it. And that change is then again impacting on those socioeconomic, political and cultural circumstances. So in terms of prevalence of violence and harassment and what I was just talking about, I would like to show you this slide. It shows that in the northern and more centrally located countries in Europe, the prevalence or reported prevalence is much higher than in the southern countries and Eastern European countries. What it also shows is the awareness levels, and they are indicated here by the green bubbles. So the bigger the green bubble, the higher the awareness level. The darker the blue color, the higher the reporting levels. So what it shows is basically the higher the awareness levels, the higher the reporting, which means that you can't necessarily say everything is okay in the south of Europe. What we also found is that for instance, south of Europe, I don't want to single it out. What we also found is that the ideal case of low reporting and high awareness didn't exist in any European country. It didn't exist in any European country. I would like to add yet, because I hope we are getting there at some point. I just selected a couple of slides for you in terms of highlighting the prevalence levels in Europe. Just some of the interesting ones, just for the sake of time. This one refers to the difference between people experiencing violence and harassment if they are born in the country where it was measured, or if they were born elsewhere. So you could generally say between migrants and nationals or non-migrants. So what you can see here is that in most countries, workers whose parents or themselves were born outside of the country where it was measured are more likely to experience violence and harassment. This slide will be very interesting for you as well, because I guess also in New Zealand, especially in the public sector, we see more non-standard employment, temporary employment and flexible work arrangements. And this slide is highlighting that the more insecure your work is, the more likely you are to be exposed to violence and harassment. This one is showing you the sectoral distribution of violence and harassment. And it wasn't a big surprise for us at the time to see that social work and health is one of the professions where people are most exposed to violence and harassment. Exactly, and public administration is actually the fourth down from the top highest, which is quite striking as well. So what fosters violence and harassment? We did a bit of analysis in terms of looking at relationships, associations between working conditions and violence and harassment. And what we found was that the most important factor in being exposed to or experiencing violence and harassment was the stress level. Increased stress, increased working demands had the biggest negative impact on violence and harassment. Another point was quite important as well, and that was related to change and restructuring in the workplace. And people were often talking, due to the change and the restructuring, they had even less time to do their job, hence they had more stress at work and also a poorer work-life balance. And the third one related to the organizational and social resources of a workplace. And it is related, as you can see here, to the type of contract that you would hold, or you hold in the workplace, like which would increase your risk of losing a job. And also people were often referring to their managers, for example, being not very capable of planning well. And that, of course, increased the stress levels for people as well if they got stuff to do last minute and things like that. So what kind of impacts did those working conditions have on workers? I just selected this slide because I think it's quite relevant for the New Zealand context, especially in terms of looking at mental health at risk that was reported by people who are exposed to violence and harassment. It's the second block here. Yeah. The orange bar indicates that people who were exposed to violence and harassment reported that their mental health was at risk. So it means that around about 30% of people who answered the survey reported that their mental health was at risk. In the European context, the last bar there on the right side is very important as well, where people assess their ability to work beyond the age of 60 if they were exposed to violence and harassment. And you can see here that, people, nearly half of the people thought they wouldn't be able to work beyond that age. Very important for the retirement schemes we have in Europe because they're usually beyond 60. And therefore the level of your pension decreases substantially. Impacts on business, we looked at that as well. As a tripartite agency, we always have a focus on the impacts for unions and also the impacts of for business. So in general, I think the bottom line was that usually businesses experience higher costs when a lot of violence and harassment occurs in the workplace. Due to higher job turnover, people don't stay as long. They are less productive than their colleagues. They are less able or willing to work longer. And also they are more often sick and staying at home. Prevention of violence and harassment, the last part of my presentation. We found that in terms of countries having a good legal definition of violence and harassment enshrined in their legislation, their national legislation, helped a lot to actually adopt and implement as well prevention, longer-term prevention policies. And it also was often linked to having particular company level or organizational level measures in place to prevent violence and harassment. These are government activities that were dominating the European scene, and I guess a lot of these are actually known by all of you as well, the adoption of legislation, then supporting organizational health and safety measures and activities. Often the government took the lead in defining the scope and content of interventions, and they cooperated with other actors on implementing policies. Social partner activities. There's quite a lot, partly due to the framework agreement that I mentioned at the beginning, quite a lot going on in Europe. We have actually collective agreements that have substantive parts on violence and harassment. For example, in the Netherlands, there is a sectoral agreement, which means it covers a whole sector, in this case local government. And what that collective agreement stipulates is that you have violence coordinators in every business that operates in the local government sector. And they also committed to have a new reporting system in place, which then helped together, those two components helped to substantially reduce violence and harassment in local government in the Netherlands, just as one example. The social partners, either together or separately, engage a lot in drafting guidelines and facilitating those guidelines to their members, running awareness-raising campaigns. As I mentioned, they do that together sometimes in bipartite activities. Training of counselors, very important as well. Training of other members and of health and safety representatives. Then they make resource centers available, often online. They have extensive websites with courses, online courses with reading material, helplines available where you can call and ask for support. And they also are part of events that are broader than just focusing on violence and harassment, such as well-being events in general to stipulate good health and stress relief. An integrated or coherent approach, does it actually exist in Europe? I don't want to talk about it too much because it's not such a rosy picture, to be honest. They are only in 8 countries. We see a well-developed, integrated and coherent approach. And just to remind you, there are 28 countries. Recommendations, and I would like to finish with that. The report, as I mentioned earlier, highlighted the importance of awareness-raising campaigns and better reporting as well. So the underlying statistical measures are very important. Then improving and clarifying legislation. Very often you find it spread across different legislative branches and instruments, which often doesn't help. Another very important factor, improve the working conditions of people, reduce stress levels, reduce restructuring, and train your managers better. That was one of the core messages. And also a very, very important one, improve policy coherence. I think I couldn't stress that one enough, because it's very important not to have isolated measures or policies. They need to be interlinked and they need to be interwoven in order to be effective. And linked to that, of course, is the integration of different actors, such as the social partners and also other civil society organizations. Yeah, and I would just like to, I just found this little piece of information the other day at the beginning of February. The Minister for Women committed to, or said that the government would start committed to tracking sexual misconduct in the workplace. And we'll keep an eye on that and see where that one goes. But it is obviously a topic of interest. It is a topic that is discussed. It is a topic that the government seems to commit to. We just need to own the implementation process altogether and include all actors in the scene, on the scene into the policy development and actually, of course, very important, the implementation of those policies. So if you have any, I would like to finish here. If you have any clarification questions, please don't hesitate to ask. We would like to have the discussion after both presentations because they are complementing each other. So if I can just invite you to ask your clarification questions, and then we move on to Hamish and Jeff's presentation. No questions? Great. Thank you so much for listening and enjoy the next presentation.
Hi everyone, it's good to see you all here. I'm Jeff Plummer from Victoria University, and I'm not used to using a microphone. And I'm going to do this with Hamish, and we're going to do this awkward tag team with the microphone, so you'll find entertainment at least one way. So, first of all, I will start, and my first issue is bullying a problem? Well, internationally, a meta-analysis found it was about 10 to 20% of workers in various studies, mainly around OECD type countries, experience bullying. Depends a great deal how you measure it, how you ask it. So I have some New Zealand studies here. O'Driscoll used quite a sophisticated negative acts questionnaire that has a threshold of 1 incident per week for 6 months, and that found 17.8, so that says it's quite high across those 4 sectors. The PSA survey used a very open-ended question. Have you experienced bullying in the last 6 months? Over 32%, so that's pretty high. That's subjective. But that tallies up with the SSC's Integrity and Conduct Survey, which found 25% had personally experienced bullying and harassment in the last 12 months. 28% had observed it. 23% had seen abusive or intimidating behaviour. So we most recently used a shortened version of the negative acts questionnaire and found 13%. So of only 13% reported bullying, so we can say that's fantastic to some small extent. But we did find quite a lot of what you could generally call shabby behaviours. Plenty of poor behaviour reported sometimes, withholding information, gossip, exclusion, practical jokes, not so common but it does happen, denigrating other people's work. So one of the things I would like to see if we can move the conversation beyond so much worrying about whether behaviours represent bullying behaviours or not, is to talk generally about positive and negative or workplace behaviours, things that are generally shabby in the workplace, because I think all these studies show that that is a problem. And that's one of the things that came out in Hamish's research, where across 12 core government departments, 72% of complaints weren't found to be legitimate complaints of bullying. So roughly 18% of complaints are upheld.
And that was through formal investigations as well.
Yeah, that was through formal investigations as well. So I think there's a paradox of bullying behaviours or bullying reporting, is that a lot of complaints are not substantiated, but there's an awful lot of bullying that takes place that is never reported. And we know from the international research that most cases of bullying are not reported. Unfortunately, in New Zealand, what we see is that many of the ones that are don't meet the definition of bullying. If you have confidence in the investigations, of course. So now I will hand over to Hamish.
Okay. Nice to see you all here. So I really hate this.
It doesn't matter, you still need to use it.
Yeah.
That was strong management, not bullying, by the way.
Well, is it ongoing? Okay, so we'll look at, I kind of like the public health model. It's kind of a way organisations can structure their responses to workplace bullying. So we have primary, secondary and tertiary interventions, so 3 levels. Primary interventions are primarily focused on preventing bullying. Secondary interventions, looking at managing bullying sort of once it's occurred. And tertiary interventions, they look at the ongoing management of workplace bullying. So what do you do after you've had that formal investigation and someone's been found guilty? How do you make sure that bullying doesn't re-escalate again? And I think it's important to note that there's quite a fine line between each of those levels. So, some researchers might put an anti-bullying policy as a primary intervention, others might see it more as a secondary intervention, and so yeah, it's just important to keep that in mind. And I will hand you back over to Jeff.
Right. Okay, so I've lost Hamish. Are you doing the slide?
No, you're doing prevention.
Prevention. Right. Okay. I regain my composure. So, prevention. Well, what we found is that a lot of the policies are very concerned with stage 2, managing investigations, legal bureaucratic compliance. They're quite weak at actually stopping it happening. And we think that this is a tremendous area of neglect. So one of the things in the PSA research we did, PSA survey we did, was we looked at high and low bullying organisations, and we found that such talk to or listen to the responses of people who weren't bullied, and they confirmed that these organisations had poor cooperation between business units, between groups, between teams, low trust and support, and unresponsive management. So I think some basic steps around selecting, managing, performance managing, developing leaders, team supervisors, holding them to account to do their job as well and supporting them to do so is one of the sort of basic primary steps that I think is sorely needed. There was a Norwegian study looking at the characteristics of bullies. It found that people likely to be accused of bullying, that's some carefully worded phraseology there, had low conscientiousness and high neuroticism, so they come from the big 5 personality issues, and were also stressed. So partly that's a job design issue around stress, partly it's a personal issue, but I like to see more attention to organisations screening out, avoiding people prone to bullying, maybe behavioural event interviews that are more targeted to interpersonal behaviours, reference checks, possibly personality tests, although there's some legitimate debate about that. But essentially, my concern is that I hear too many stories of dysfunctional managers staying in the public service, often sustaining their careers quite well. And we know from the research quite clearly that bureaucratic hierarchies are safe places for dysfunctional managers. And actually tackling that issue is one of the best preventative solutions that I would like to see take place. Most of the bullying, from what we can see in our research, is from the top down. So as Andrea pointed out, it can be horizontal, it can even be upwards, from staff bullying the boss, but most of it seems to be from the boss, the supervisor, downwards. And that seems to continue too long. Occasionally I hear stories about a dysfunctional manager being eased out, pushed into a struggling Crown entity, for instance, that has even weaker HR practices than a core government department. And they're left there to cause their havoc. So that is one of my soapbox pitches. And just before we go on into thinking, well, maybe these targets are just weak people, some research came out recently that actually targets of bullying are often quite high achieving, or particularly high achieving, confident people who need to be brought down to size in the views of their managers. So let's not trivialise this issue. And on that cheerful note, I now pass over to you, Hamish.
Okay, so I'd like quickly just to look at some research I did around anti-bullying policies in the core kind of public service. So a sample of 15 departments, representatives, small and large, and we've got here the 8 kind of key features recommended by researchers that should be included within anti-bullying policies. As you can see, departments have done reasonably well, including the key features. 2 standouts there though, specific contact details, not really included. That's probably really for practical reasons. You can't put every manager's contact details in there, so that's probably fine. So long as you've got HR, you've got union, you're good there. Consequences of breaching policy, that is a bit concerning. very few departments actually explicitly stated what are the consequences for perpetrators of bullying. And the research does show that organisations who do clearly articulate those consequences, they do have lower levels of workplace bullying. Quickly looking at secondary management. Essentially, secondary intervention was done quite well by public service departments, generally, focused on managing workplace bullying, the formal investigations, that sort of thing. It really was the main focus, or is the main focus of current public service intervention for workplace bullying, harassment, etc. Mediation is occasionally used by departments for resolving conflict. However, that doesn't always work, and that may be down to conflict, reaching a stage where you actually can't get the parties together in a room to actually resolve that situation. So then a formal investigation is required. Employee assistance programs are also used to a limited extent. Looking at tertiary management, so that ongoing management once you've, determined that bullying has occurred. A large number of tertiary interventions are recommended by researchers. A lot of these are quite, from the Scandinavian context, so counselling, inpatient treatment, physiotherapy, exercise. The relevance to New Zealand is questionable. However, the research in Scandinavia does show that these do work. So it's certainly something for New Zealand organisations to think about. However, a really interesting finding from my research was that public service departments are using MB's mediation service to actually kind of repair relationships following, the conclusion of a formal investigation into bullying. So where two people have to work together again, MB's mediation service is really useful for repairing those relationships. And I think there are about 3 or 4 departments who mention that, and so it's certainly something for other organisations to definitely consider. And I will pass you back over to Jeff.
So I will just continue with the mediation thing for a second. So shout out to MB's mediation service for repairing workplace relationships following resolution of conflict. Mediation seems to be good at quite early stages of a conflict before it's really escalated, and at the end when essentially the justice issues have been healed and we're trying to bring people back together again. But there is a body of research that says mediation is quite flawed to actually resolve issues of bullying conflict. And some of the reasons that are given in the literature is it can force or it can be forced on people, including victims, and so cause further harm. It doesn't recognise the power imbalance and can even reinforce those, not take those into account. The confidential nature of them often means that patterns of behaviour aren't recognised and are concealed, and it can insufficiently punish past behaviours, creating feelings of injustice. So mediation is a fantastic tool, but it does need to be treated quite cautiously as a resolution to bullying conflicts. So we would like to see some resolutions. And essentially the core of the focus is, I would say, focusing more on primary and more on tertiary.
Definitely.
And if we do more on primary, hopefully we'll need less on tertiary anyway. So, did we lose a slide? Here we are. Sorry. So the few things is, one of the things that came through is that although a lot of the policies are very formal, bureaucratic and legalistic, bullying is an inherently social phenomenon, and it's also ambiguous. In situations like that, tacit, informal rules, office culture, climate, leadership, trust and leadership really come into play and really count. And so I would like to see more attention paid to those sort of things. In our most recent PSA survey we did, scores for psychosocial safety climate, which is in a sense asking people how much do your senior managers care about their psychological well-being of staff, pretty ambivalent results. And also we need to realise in a sense, the experience of many people that work in the ER field. So when I talk to employment lawyers, other people in the field, line managers, HR people, they'll often tell me stories about how bullying is used as a counterattack in a performance situation. People about to be accused of bullying will get in first with a bullying allegation of their own, and they report quite a degree of cynicism about how bullying allegations are used. And so I think there's worth having a discussion about, because we know there's a lot of bullying that doesn't get complained about, and it is a really serious issue. Sometimes it gets tied up with judgments of perpetrator intent. I think it's a complete red herring. The worst incident, I think, was Karen Sewell's saying that Katrina Bates building a housing didn't mean to harm the person, and therefore it wasn't so bad. I think it's judging people's motivations, I think, is very tricky, very subjective. And we'd also think that more attention should be given to the role of unions. I mean, we found out very clearly that unions play a really useful role in both developing policies, helping manage them, filtering allegations, resolving them. And what I'd like to see is something closer to a European social partnership model where unions were actually given the credibility and the recognition that they do behind the scenes for organisations in helping address this important issue. And on that note, we come to our questions, I think. Yeah. Okay, so we have some questions. Obviously, we want to hear yours as well. What is the best approach? Kirsten, do you want to take questions?
Are you going to answer those questions?
Well, should we just put it to the audience? I mean, I think if...
No, we're not going to answer those questions. They're questions for you.
Oh.
So, there are questions from the audience first. Let's hear those first.
Okay, do you want to come up and do
Can we do one question to that, one here, one more at the moment? Okay, so we take this lady here, and then we'll just